She had worked the ranch for years, rising before sunrise to tend to horses, mend fences, and cook over flames that never seemed to die. But loyalty and sweat counted for nothing when the rancher's greed outweighed his decency. She had seen it in his eyes the day he decided her worth could be measured in coins, not effort, not heart. He had struck a deal with men who didn't care for the hardships of women who labored, men who only saw the glint of silver. And now she was here, bound and unsettled, wondering how a life built on routine could unravel so completely in a single morning. The ropes dug into her wrists and ankles, tight enough to make her pulse quicken. She could feel the coarse fibers biting into her skin, and she shifted, testing her restraints, listening to the strange silence around her. She was no stranger to hard work, but she had never been powerless in this way, never so completely at the mercy of another. Beyond the canvas of the tent, she caught glimpses of movement figures, shadows that belonged to men who moved with a quiet, dangerous purpose. Her heart hammered against her chest as the realization settled in. She was not in the familiar comfort of the ranch, not surrounded by the known faces of those who barely tolerated her presence. She was somewhere entirely new, somewhere that could be far more dangerous. The air inside the tent was thick, carrying the scent of fire, sweat, and earth. Her mind raced, mapping possibilities, tracing a route to freedom that might not exist. She thought about the rancher and the coins that had traded her life for a promise she hadn't agreed to. Anger and fear coiled together inside her, making her body tense. She thought about the world beyond the plains, beyond fences and fields, a world that could be unforgiving and cruel. And yet, there was a part of her that refused to surrender to despair. She had survived harsh winters and blistering summers, and she had endured more than anyone had expected of her. Somehow, she told herself, she would endure this too. Then she heard the voice. It was low, measured, and held an authority that made her instinctively still. "You should not be here," it said, the words rough but deliberate. She turned her head carefully, catching a glimpse of him tall, broad, with skin bronzed by the sun and eyes sharp enough to cut through lies. There was a caution in his stance, a tension in his movements, as though he expected betrayal at every turn. She saw the lines of distrust etched into his features, the hardened edge of a man who had been wronged too many times by those he could not trust. He did not speak again, only watched her, and the silence became a weight pressing down on her. Memories of the ranch, of the deal that had brought her here, flickered unbidden. She remembered the clink of coins, the rancher's smirk, the way he had looked at her as though she were an object, a thing to be bargained and sold. It made her stomach churn, made her want to rise and scream, though the ropes held her firmly in place. And yet, in this strange encounter, she sensed something more complicated than cruelty. The Apache before her was not smiling, but there was a depth in his gaze that suggested layers beneath the surface, a story etched into every line of his face. She realized she was not simply a victim here. She was an unexpected guest in a world she had never known, a world that demanded her attention, her caution, and perhaps even her respect. She tested the ropes again, flexing her wrists, careful not to provoke him. He did not flinch, did not react, only continued to study her as though he were weighing her spirit against some unseen measure. The tent's walls flapped slightly with the breeze, casting moving shadows that made the space feel smaller, more confined. Her mind darted to possibilities, escape, negotiation, appeal to whatever mercy might exist, but she had learned long ago that mercy was a rare gift, and only earned through deeds, not words. She kept her eyes on him, reading the subtle shifts in his posture, hoping to glean some hint of his intentions. Hours passed in a tense stillness, broken only by the occasional crackle of fire from the small stove in the corner. She learned the rhythm of his presence, the way he moved without sound, the way his eyes seemed to track her every motion. She realized he was not a man prone to idle chatter, nor to unnecessary cruelty. There was a discipline in his observation, a careful attention that suggested intelligence and experience in equal measure. And despite the anger that had carried her this far, a spark of curiosity began to rise within her. Who was this man? What had shaped the wary, watchful nature of someone so clearly capable of violence if provoked? She tried to speak, her voice hoarse from dryness and tension. Why? Why am I here? She asked, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of her fear and defiance. The Apache's lips tightened, and for a moment he did not answer. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees, his eyes never leaving hers. "You should not have been sold," he said finally, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Some things cannot be measured by coins." The words struck her, a curious blend of warning and acknowledgment. He did not release her, did not offer comfort, but in that brief exchange she glimpsed a truth she had not expected, that not all men were blind to injustice, even if they lived by codes she did not yet understand. Her mind raced, turning over every option, every path forward. She did not know if she could trust him, did not know if escape was possible or even wise. And yet, in the silence that followed, she felt the first faint stirrings of something she had not allowed herself in a long time: hope. Not for freedom, not yet, but for understanding. For the possibility that she might find allies in places she had not imagined, and that her journey, however frightening, might not end in despair. Outside the tent, the wind shifted, carrying distant sounds, hoofbeats, the faint rustle of movement, and the whisper of the plains. She could sense danger lurking beyond the confines of the canvas, threats she could neither see nor measure. The Apache remained still, a silent sentinel, and she realized that whatever awaited her beyond this tent, it would demand courage, wit, and a strength she had only begun to test. She shifted again, listening, waiting, and in the pause, the tension between them became almost tangible, a fragile balance of fear and understanding that neither could yet break. She remembered the faces of the rancher and the men who had taken payment, the smug confidence in their eyes, and a flicker of anger reignited within her. She would not be made into a pawn so easily, she told herself. She would endure this, survive, and somehow reclaim a measure of control over her life. The Apache's gaze remained steady, assessing, and she sensed that he too was considering his next move, the possibilities that her presence brought into his world. Neither spoke again, yet in the quiet, a conversation unfolded, a conversation of intentions, of judgment, and of the unspoken rules that bound them both in that fragile space. The fire sputtered, sending shadows across the tent walls, making the space seem smaller and more confining than it was. She shifted her weight, feeling the ropes bite a little more with each movement, and she realized that the hours ahead would demand patience as much as courage. Every instinct screamed for flight, for resistance, but she had learned that survival often required careful observation, careful choices, and an understanding of forces beyond her immediate control. She met his eyes again, steady and unflinching, and wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Fear, defiance, determination? Perhaps all of it, and perhaps none. The tent seemed to shrink around her, yet somehow it had become a place of reckoning, a crucible in which both of their wills would be tested. The Apache remained a figure of mystery and potential threat, his distrust of outsiders clear, his presence commanding. And she, bound and unsettled, felt the first stirrings of recognition that her fate was no longer dictated solely by the hands that had sold her. Here, in this tent, among the wind-swept plains and the shadowed shapes of an unfamiliar life, a new chapter of survival, understanding, and unlikely connection was beginning, one that neither of them could yet foresee, and one that promised to challenge every notion she had held about freedom, trust, and the measure of a person's worth. The night crept over the plains, and the world outside seemed both endless and dangerous. She could hear the faint sounds of animals moving through the darkness, and the occasional whisper of wind over dry grasses. Her pulse remained fast, yet a strange calm began to settle, fragile and fleeting. She did not know what awaited her come morning, whether the Apache's intentions were merciful, indifferent, or merciless. All she knew was that she was here, bound, watched, and yet strangely alive in a way that demanded attention, courage, and the first steps toward understanding a world she had never known. And as she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the ropes and the rough canvas around her, she sensed that the moment was not an end, but a beginning. The rancher's greed had set her here, but it was her own spirit that would define what came next. In the quiet of the tent, beneath the shadow of an unreadable man who despised outsiders, she waited. Something told her that the coming hours would test her in ways she could not yet imagine, and that the balance of fear, respect, and survival would hang by a thread, ready to snap with the slightest misstep. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of distant fires and the faintest trace of horses, and she realized that the world outside was moving, dangerous, and alive. And so she waited, bound but not broken, knowing that the moment when choice would meet consequence was approaching, and that nothing about her life would ever be the same again. The Apache watched her still, silent as the night, a figure of judgment and potential salvation, and she knew that in the quiet tension of that tent, the first lines of a story that neither of them could yet write were already being drawn. Her heart raced, her mind spun, and the night pressed in closer, but she would not yield. Not yet, not here. And in that suspended moment, beneath the canvas and the watchful eyes of a man who had every reason to hate her kind, the air seemed thick with the promise of trials, choices, and the uncertain turn of fate that would carry her from the hands of a greedy rancher into a world she had never known. She drew a slow breath, and the ropes bit into her wrists, a reminder that freedom was not given lightly. And the Apache's gaze met hers, steady, unyielding, and impossibly hard to read. Something was coming, she could feel it, something that would demand more than fear. More than cunning, it would demand courage, strength, and a reckoning with truths she was not yet ready to face. The tent was quiet again, but the tension lingered, like the calm before a storm, and she knew that the first move, when it came, would change everything. The night waited with her, and so did he. The fire in the corner of the tent cast long, flickering shadows that danced over the canvas walls, making them seem alive. She could see the contours of the Apache's face in the shifting light-sharp cheekbones, eyes that never left her, a mouth set in lines of quiet discipline. Every movement he made was deliberate, precise, a man shaped by survival and the hard lessons of a world that had not been kind. She wondered how long he had lived in this land, how many battles he had faced, and how much of himself he carried in silence. Her mind traced the shapes of scars she could not see, imagined the weight of experiences that made a man distrustful of strangers, especially those from lands and families he had learned to avoid. She shifted slightly, careful not to provoke a reaction, and studied the ropes that bound her. Coarse fibers, looped with skill, designed to restrain without injury, yet they reminded her of the limits placed on her by a world that had never seen her as equal. The Apache did not approach. He remained near the edge of the firelight, a figure half in shadow, observing her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. She realized that she had been sold, yes, but this man had not yet judged her completely. Perhaps he never would, or perhaps his judgment would take form she could not yet imagine. Either way, she was here, and survival meant learning quickly, reading signs and understanding intentions without relying on words alone. Her thoughts drifted back to the ranch, the familiar ache of labor and the quiet moments of solitude she had once taken for granted. She remembered the early mornings, the smell of damp hay, the gentle nicker of horses waiting for her touch, the way sunlight struck across the fence posts in long lines that promised nothing but work and persistence. And she remembered the look in the rancher's eyes, a cold calculation that valued wealth over humanity, that had turned her life into a bargain struck with coins and indifference. That memory burned like fire in her chest, fueling both fear and determination. She would not be merely a victim in this new place. She would observe, learn, and find her opening. The Apache finally moved, stepping closer, and the firelight caught the glint of something in his hands. Perhaps a tool, perhaps a weapon she could not tell, and she did not dare ask. He knelt on one knee, still watching, and then spoke again, his voice softer but no less commanding. "I do not trust easily. You must understand that before anything else." She nodded carefully, though he could not see it in the dim light. Words mattered little here. His tone, his presence, the tension in his stance, all were lessons in survival that she needed to interpret. She had grown up reading people, learning to read gestures and glances where words failed. It would not be enough for freedom, but it might be enough for understanding. Her eyes flicked around the tent. Supplies were sparse but well-organized bundles of dried food, a water skin, a blanket, and what looked like carefully maintained tools. Everything had a purpose, a place, and an order that suggested a life lived in careful preparation for moments of danger. She realized that this man, despite his distrust, was no stranger to hardship, no stranger to planning and the discipline that survival required. And yet, the ropes that held her reminded her that she was a stranger in his world, an unpredictable element that could disrupt the careful balance he had built. She thought about escape, as she always did. The thought came unbidden, a reflex born of necessity, yet she quickly tempered it. The plains outside the tent were wild and unforgiving, and the Apache's vigilance was constant. Any attempt to flee could end in injury or worse. She forced herself to focus instead on observation, on understanding the rhythms of the man who held her. Every gesture, every pause, every glance became data to be considered. She could not afford mistakes, not here, not now. Hours passed with little change. She learned his habits without speaking, the way he moved when fetching water, the careful attention to the fire, the subtle way he adjusted his stance when listening for sounds outside the tent. He was alert but not frantic, controlled but not cruel. There was a precision to his movements, a quiet efficiency that spoke of years surviving in a land where mistakes could be deadly. And yet, despite the distance he maintained, there was an awareness of her presence that suggested he was not entirely indifferent. Perhaps he saw potential. Or perhaps he simply recognized the human instinct to endure, to resist, to fight even when restrained. The night deepened, and the firelight began to dim, leaving the corners of the tent in near darkness. She could hear the faint rustle of animals moving in the distance, the subtle hum of the wind over the plains. Each sound sharpened her senses, reminding her that she was no longer in a controlled environment, no longer surrounded by the predictable routines of the ranch. This was a land that required vigilance, that punished carelessness, and she felt the weight of that reality pressing down on her chest. When the Apache finally spoke again, his voice was low, carrying an authority that demanded attention. "Your past has brought you here, but your choices will determine what comes next." She met his gaze, trying to read meaning in the deep brown of his eyes. There was a warning there, yes, but also a challenge, a recognition that she was not merely an object to be controlled, that she carried the capacity for action, for decision, for survival. She felt a flicker of hope tempered by fear. Her fate was uncertain, but not entirely sealed. Her mind turned over the possibilities. Could she appeal to him, earn a measure of trust, or would any attempt at negotiation be seen as weakness? She recalled stories she had heard in passing, tales of outsiders entering these lands and failing because they underestimated the intelligence, the cunning, and the resolve of those who knew the plains intimately. She could not afford missteps. Every movement, every word, every glance could determine her future. She had learned to live under pressure, to think ahead, and now she would need all those skills to survive the hours, days, and unknown trials that awaited. She allowed herself a moment to consider the man before her, This Apache whose distrust of white people was clear, yet tempered by a code she could only guess at. He was both guardian and challenge, a force she could neither ignore nor confront recklessly. She felt a strange mixture of fear, curiosity, and a cautious respect. Survival here would not be about escape alone. It would be about understanding, observation, and the subtle negotiation of power in a world that respected strength and vigilance above all else. Outside the tent, the plains shifted under the moonlight. Shadows moved with the subtle grace of animals, and she could hear the faint rustle of grasses and distant calls of nocturnal life. She realized that the Apache was not merely a threat or captor. He was part of this landscape, shaped by it, and perhaps, in his own way, a protector of it. And in that realization, she saw the first threads of connection between them, a tenuous link forged by circumstance, caution, and the unspoken understanding that both were navigating a world that could turn deadly at any moment. Time passed, measured by the shifting light of the fire and the cadence of the wind. She tested her thoughts, planning what she could, learning his rhythms, anticipating his actions. She understood that her survival depended not only on patience, but also on insight, the ability to perceive intentions where they were not spoken, to read the subtleties of movement and expression. It was a lesson in restraint as much as it was a test of courage, and she felt the weight of it pressing upon her. The Apache moved again, tending to the fire and supplies with quiet efficiency. He did not speak, but she could feel his awareness, the vigilance that never faltered. He was a man shaped by necessity, by survival, and perhaps by loss. She wondered what stories lay behind the careful control of his movements, what pain or betrayal had taught him to distrust, to guard, to measure every encounter. And she realized that to navigate this new existence, she would need to understand not just the land, but the man who ruled it with quiet authority. She thought of the rancher and the world she had left behind, the life traded for coins and indifference. Anger simmered beneath her fear, a constant reminder that she was not merely a passive figure in this story. She had agency, even if it was constrained, and she would find ways to assert it, carefully, strategically, as she had learned to do in the fields, the stables, and the harsh routines of a life earned by sweat. The Apache's presence was daunting, but it was also a challenge, a test of her wits, endurance, and resolve. The night deepened further, and the tent seemed to grow smaller, pressing in around her with a quiet intensity. The fire flickered low, casting the last remnants of light across his features, and she caught a glimmer of something unexpected, a flicker of calculation, a trace of recognition that she was not entirely without value in his eyes. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest that the tension between them was not one-sided. He too was observing, learning, and weighing possibilities. She drew a slow, measured breath, letting her mind focus on observation, on reading the signs, on understanding the rhythms of a man whose life was shaped by hardship and vigilance. Every detail mattered. The shift of his stance, the way his eyes narrowed at distant sounds, the subtle adjustments of his body as he moved within the tent. Survival depended on attention, patience, and an understanding of forces beyond her immediate control. She had lived by similar rules on the ranch, and she would live by them here too, even if the landscape and the challenges were entirely new. Hours passed in this tense quiet. The fire dwindled, and the first hints of dawn touched the edges of the canvas. She remained bound but alert, aware of the fragile balance between fear and understanding, between caution and defiance. The Apache's gaze met hers once more, and she felt the weight of it, a silent communication that spoke of judgment, expectation, and the tests yet to come. Whatever awaited beyond the canvas of the tent, whatever decisions were to be made, the first steps had already been drawn. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of the plains and the faint echoes of life beyond the tent. She felt the ropes against her wrists, the confinement of the space, and the looming presence of the man who had brought her here, yet she did not despair. She had endured hardships before, faced dangers she had never imagined, and she would endure this as well. The world beyond was unknown, dangerous, and unforgiving, but she was not without resource, without intelligence, without resolve. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering her strength, measuring her pulse, and preparing herself for the next challenge. The Apache's gaze remained fixed, a silent sentinel marking time, judging, calculating. And she knew that the tension, the uncertainty, the fragile balance of power and survival was far from over. The night had passed, but the dawn brought no answers, only the promise of trials, choices, and the reckoning of what it truly meant to endure in a land ruled by strength, vigilance, and unspoken codes of survival. The fire smoldered low, the wind whispered across the plains, and she waited, bound but not broken, knowing that the world outside the tent and the man within it held tests she could not yet predict. Every heartbeat, every glance, every movement would matter. And as the first light of morning touched the canvas, she realized that her life, once confined to the routines of the ranch, had been thrust into a story of survival, trust, and discovery that would demand everything she had and more. She drew another steady breath, feeling the weight of ropes and the presence of a man who distrusted her kind. The wind carried distant sounds and the faint, sharp scent of smoke from somewhere far off. And in that moment, she knew that the tent, the Apache, and the plains beyond were only the beginning of a journey she could neither control nor fully foresee. But she would endure, she would observe, and she would survive. The story of her life was changing, and nothing about it would ever be the same again. The first light of morning crept through the edges of the tent, thin shafts of pale gold cutting across the canvas and illuminating the dust that floated in the air. She stirred, muscles aching from the tight ropes, but her eyes were sharp, alert. The Apache sat near the fire, tending it with the same careful precision she had noticed the night before. His movements were measured, controlled, almost meditative, but she knew from instinct that they were born of experience, of necessity, of survival honed over years of hardship. There was a rhythm to him, a way of being that spoke of danger and discipline, and she understood that to act recklessly would invite disaster. Her mind wandered to the ranch, to the transaction that had brought her here. Coins clinking in greedy hands, the rancher's dismissive smile, the indifference to her existence. It was hard to reconcile that life with the one unfolding now beneath this canvas in the hands of a man who distrusted her very kind. And yet, she could not deny the strange fascination she felt toward him. There was a strength in his presence, a clarity in his eyes, a worldliness in the lines of his face that suggested he had lived through dangers she could barely imagine. The Apache spoke, voice low and deliberate. You watch too much, think too much. Observation is good, but it can also betray you. She did not flinch. She had lived by observation, by careful assessment of her surroundings. She replied carefully, each word chosen. I have learned that survival depends on knowing more than the one who watches. He did not respond immediately, only lifted his gaze briefly to meet hers. In that silent exchange, a tension passed between them, an unspoken challenge that neither could ignore. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly, the tall grasses bending in the morning breeze. She caught glimpses of distant movement, a flicker of hooves, a shadow of figures she could not identify. Her mind raced with possibilities. Travelers, raiders, perhaps men connected to the deal that had sold her. Or perhaps it was the natural rhythm of life in the plains, unaware of the tension inside the small canvas enclosure. She could not act yet. She had no weapons, no allies, and the rope still held her. But she noted everything, storing it away, turning observation into strategy. The Apache finally broke the silence, moving to sit across from her. Your past has brought danger here, he said. Not all of it follows the coin. Some of it comes for reasons you may not yet understand. She tried to read between the lines. He was referring to more than the sale, more than the greed of the rancher. There were threats beyond that transaction, currents in the world she had yet to perceive. And if she hoped to survive, she had to understand the layers of risk she now faced, some of which involved this man's choices as much as her own. She tested her voice again, careful, calm. "Why do you keep me here? You could have left me, let me wander, or sent me back to the men who sold me." His eyes darkened slightly, and she saw a shadow cross his features. "To leave you to them would be a mistake," he said. "And to trust you blindly would be a mistake as well. Survival is measured by what you see and what you choose to do with it." His words hinted at something she did not yet understand. There were rules to this place, codes of conduct that went beyond fear or greed. Perhaps, she realized, he was bound by them as much as she was bound by the ropes. She shifted her focus, trying to piece together more of the man in front of her. The Apache's life had clearly been shaped by violence and betrayal, by moments where trust could have been fatal. Every movement, every glance, every silence carried meaning. She wondered about the events that had hardened him, that made him wary of strangers and distrustful of those who came from lands beyond his own. And she realized that survival here would require not just patience, but an understanding of his mind, of the lessons he had learned in a world that had given him little mercy. The day passed slowly. The fire dwindled and was relit, the sun rose high above the plains, and she noted the subtle changes in light, temperature, and the shifting sounds outside. At one point, she heard voices men approaching, their words carried faintly by the wind. The Apache's body tensed, movements precise, controlled. He shifted to block her from the entrance, eyes scanning, hand resting lightly on the edge of a knife she had not noticed before. She felt the ropes tighten in her awareness, the danger palpable, and she realized that whatever those men wanted, it was not just a chance encounter. Something had drawn them here, or perhaps something had followed her. The voices receded, leaving only the sound of wind and distant hooves. She allowed herself a brief exhale, but her heart continued to race. The Apache did not speak of what had passed, nor did he ease his vigilance. She understood that this was the first layer of conflict she would have to navigate threats outside the tent, dangers tied to the men who had sold her, and perhaps even enemies she did not yet know existed. Survival required more than endurance. It required attention, strategy, and the ability to predict the moves of others before they came. Her mind began to wander, not from fear, but from the need to plan, to anticipate. She thought of ways she could use her knowledge of the ranch, of the habits of men who sought easy gain, against those who might come for her. She also thought of the Apache and the strange balance he represented, both danger and protection, both observer and participant in her survival. She realized that understanding him was as vital as understanding the world outside the tent. Each was a test of judgment, of patience, and of the capacity to act when the moment came. As afternoon passed into evening, a subtle shift occurred. She noticed small signs in the Apache's movements, a glance toward the canvas entrance, a tightening of his jaw, the way his hands hovered over his tools. Something was coming, something he anticipated but had not yet revealed. She felt a thrill of fear mixed with a spark of strategy. She did not yet know what it was, but she would watch, wait, and learn. Survival demanded no less. She spoke again, this time cautiously. "If danger is coming, then we must prepare." The Apache's eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. "Preparation is not just about tools," he said. "It is about understanding what is coming and what must be done when it arrives." The words were cryptic, yet she felt their weight. He was warning her, instructing her, perhaps testing her at the same time. She could sense a lesson hidden in his tone, a principle of survival that went beyond weapons or fire into the realm of anticipation and instinct. Her mind replayed the moment she had been sold, the clink of coins, the indifference in the rancher's eyes. That transaction had set in motion a chain of events she could not yet control. She realized that the conflict she faced now was larger than the tent, larger than the ropes that bound her. The world outside was shifting, unpredictable, and fraught with danger. She had to learn the rules of this place, the unspoken codes, the hidden patterns that govern survival and influence. And she understood that she would have to navigate them carefully, balancing caution with courage, observation with action, patience with decisiveness. Night came again, bringing shadows and silence. She listened to the subtle noises outside, the rustle of grass, the faint movement of animals, the distant sound of hooves. The Apache remained alert, a figure of quiet command, and she realized that he was as much a part of this environment as the plains themselves. His knowledge, his discipline, his instincts were tools she would need to understand, to anticipate, perhaps even to leverage if the moments demanded it. She allowed herself to study him more closely. There were signs of past battles etched into his hands and face, evidence of a life that had demanded strength, skill, and vigilance. She wondered what had made him distrustful of white men, of outsiders, of strangers in general. And she considered that perhaps his anger or caution was rooted in losses she could not imagine, in betrayals that had shaped his very identity. She felt a strange mixture of empathy and caution, recognizing that he was not a monster, but a man shaped by circumstances as unforgiving as her own. The tension between them remained, taut and unbroken. She tested her voice again, careful, measured. "If I am to survive here, I must understand more than you know. I need to know what you expect." The Apache studied her, eyes narrowing slightly, then he spoke. "Expectation is a burden. You survive by knowing what is around you, by reading signs others miss, by acting when the moment comes. Words alone will not save you." She understood instantly that he was teaching her something fundamental, that survival in this land was a combination of observation, intuition, and action. Words were secondary, preparation and understanding were primary. Hours passed in this tense rhythm, the fire low and flickering, the tent walls swaying slightly in the wind. She studied every movement, every sound, every shadow. She felt the threads of the outside world pressing against this fragile space, threats she could not yet see, and the weight of the ropes reminded her that freedom was conditional, temporary, and earned. And yet, in the careful observation of the Apache, she felt a strange measure of guidance, a structure in the chaos that might yet allow her to survive whatever was coming. Her thoughts returned to the subplots of her life, the rancher, the men who had bought and sold her, the unknown dangers waiting beyond the canvas. She realized that each of these threads intertwined with the other, creating a web of conflict, opportunity, and risk. Survival would require navigating them all, understanding which threats were immediate, which were distant, and which were tied to choices yet to be made. And she understood that her understanding of the Apache, of his codes, of his rhythms, would be just as vital as her ability to anticipate the movements of those outside. The figures outside moved closer still, careful, deliberate, and she realized that the confrontation was near. The Apache's body tensed, his eyes calculating, and she understood that the final moment of testing, the moment where patience met action, was approaching. She could feel it in the air, in the subtle shifts of light and shadow, in the quiet hum of anticipation that wrapped the tent in a cocoon of suspense. She glanced at him, trying to read his thoughts, his strategies, the choices he had made in preparation for this moment. There was a calm beneath the surface, a stillness that spoke of readiness, experience, and confidence in the face of imminent danger. And she understood that survival would depend not just on following his lead, but on anticipating the moves he had already prepared for, on sensing the right moment to act, on being more than just a passive observer. The night held its breath. The wind whispered across the plains. The distant hooves were faint now, but deliberate, purposeful. She felt the tension coil tighter, every muscle, every nerve alive with anticipation. The ropes, the tent, the Apache's presence, All of it was part of a prelude to a moment that would test courage, intelligence, and the ability to act decisively. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the unseen threat, and she knew that the climax, the confrontation, the moment where every choice would matter, was approaching. The fire flickered low, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and she understood that beyond the canvas, the world held danger, opportunity, and the first steps toward a resolution that neither she nor the Apache could yet fully imagine. And as she drew a slow breath, preparing herself for what was coming, she felt a strange combination of fear, anticipation, and determination. Every lesson, every observation, every moment of patience had led to this. The tension was at its peak. Outside, the unknown pressed closer, and inside, the man who had brought her here watched and waited, a guide and a sentinel. The moment of reckoning was near, and she knew that when it came, there would be no turning back, only the choice to act with courage, wit, and unyielding resolve. The plains were silent now, almost unnaturally so, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The Apache's gaze met hers, dark and unreadable, and in that instant, she knew that every moment, every shadow, every unseen movement had led to this point. The climax of the conflict was near, the tipping point where patience and strategy would meet action, and she could feel the story of her survival hanging by a thread, fragile yet full of possibility. The wind shifted once more, carrying distant noises that hinted at movement, at danger, at the confrontation about to erupt. She felt the tension coil inside her, a living thing, and she knew that the moment of choice, of decisive action, was almost upon them. And in that charged silence, she understood that the world outside the tent and the man within it would define the next chapter of her life, a chapter poised on the edge of suspense, danger, and the first glimpse of hope. She drew a final, steady breath, feeling the ropes against her wrists, the firelight flickering over her face, and the presence of the Apache beside her. The climax approached, the moment of reckoning and test, and the tension was absolute. Beyond the tent, danger awaited. Within it, patience, observation, and courage would be the keys to survival. And as the night stretched across the plains, she knew that the story of her endurance, her strength, and her first steps toward a new beginning were about to unfold. The first crack of dawn painted the plains in soft shades of gold and amber, chasing the shadows that had stretched across the night. The tense silence of the hours before had given way to movement, deliberate and calculated. She could feel the change in the air, the subtle shift from anticipation to action, from fear to possibility. The Apache moved with quiet authority, his eyes scanning the horizon as he assessed the threat and the path forward. She realized then that this was not merely a test of survival, it was a lesson in courage, trust, and understanding the ways of the world that had brought her here. The ropes around her wrists had loosened overnight, and she flexed her fingers carefully, aware of the freedom they gave her. The Apache had not removed them entirely. He still measured her, gauging her patience and restraint, but it was clear that he recognized her growth, her ability to understand the rhythm of danger, and her capacity to act with awareness rather than impulse. She felt a flicker of pride, a quiet acknowledgement that she had learned, adapted, and endured. Outside, the first signs of life stirred on the plains. Birds took flight from the grasses, their calls cutting through the morning air. In the distance, she could see the shapes of the men who had been circling during the night, their approach slowed, hesitant, as if sensing the shift in control. The Apache knelt briefly, assessing their positions, then stood and gestured for her to remain calm. His eyes met hers, and in that moment she understood that trust, however tentative, had begun to form between them. She stepped lightly, careful not to draw unnecessary attention, and moved closer to the fire. The Apache nodded, approving, and she sensed the first fragile connection of partnership. They were two people, bound by circumstance and circumstance alone, standing at the edge of conflict, yet prepared to meet it not as adversaries but as allies. The tension from the night had not disappeared, but it had transformed into readiness, a coiled energy waiting to be released with precision and intelligence. The figures outside shifted again, closer this time, and the Apache's hand rested lightly on the edge of his weapon. She held her breath, but instead of fear, there was a sharp clarity. She understood her role now, not a captive waiting helplessly, but an active participant, a presence whose observation and insight mattered. She could see the men faltering, unsure, sensing that their calculated advantage was slipping. The plains themselves seemed to hold their breath along with her, the wind carrying only the faint rustle of grass and distant animal life. A sudden movement caught her eye, a flash of metal reflecting sunlight. The Apache's stance tightened, and he gave a brief nod, almost imperceptible to her. She understood. It was her moment to act in a small but crucial way. She reached carefully for a bundle of tools near the edge of the fire, selecting one that could distract, create sound, and draw attention without harming anyone. Her hands were steady now, her mind sharpened by hours of tension and observation. She tossed it lightly, and the clatter drew the eyes of the approaching men, giving the Apache the opening he needed. In a swift, fluid motion, the Apache moved, cutting across the small clearing with precision. He confronted the men, not with unnecessary violence, but with authority and confidence that left no room for doubt. Their movements faltered, hesitation taking hold where aggression had once driven them. She watched, breath held, as the balance of power shifted in an instant. The skills he had honed over a lifetime, calculation, timing, patience, had turned the threat into a controlled encounter. The men retreated slowly, muttering under their breath, and then began to disappear into the plains. The tension that had coiled so tightly over the night slowly released, replaced by a sense of relief that was both profound and liberating. She allowed herself a quiet smile, realizing that she had survived, that the first challenge of the new chapter of her life had been met, and that she had played an active role in its resolution. The Apache turned toward her, a faint expression of respect in his eyes. He did not speak at first, allowing the silence to affirm the change that had occurred. Then, slowly, he said, "You are more capable than I believed. That is why you remain. That is why you have learned what it means to endure here." She met his gaze and nodded, the ropes now only symbolic of her former confinement, the bond of experience stronger than any physical restraint. They returned to the tent, the morning sun now spilling warmth and light across the canvas walls. She flexed her wrists fully, feeling the comfort of freedom, and allowed herself a deeper breath than she had taken in days. The Apache prepared a simple meal, offering her a portion with a quiet nod. It was not just nourishment. It was an acknowledgement, a bridge built from shared experience and mutual respect. She accepted it, understanding that survival was no longer a solitary endeavor, but one in which partnership and trust could make the difference between life and death. As they ate, the Apache shared small details of the plains, of the land, of the rhythms and patterns that dictated survival. His words were measured, each one carrying insight that went beyond instruction. She listened intently, absorbing every lesson, every nuance, understanding that knowledge itself was a tool as any weapon or plan. She realized that her time in the tent, bound and observed, had been preparation not for punishment, but for understanding, for learning the ways of the world she had been thrown into. In the hours that followed, she explored the edges of the camp, testing her movements, noting the landscape, observing the subtle signs of life and danger. The Apache remained close but did not bind her. He offered guidance without control, a mentor without domination. She felt the first stirrings of confidence, a recognition that the future, though uncertain, was now navigable through awareness, skill, and trust. Their conversation shifted, moving to the past she had endured, the greed of the rancher, the betrayal of those who had sold her, the world she had left behind. She spoke cautiously, choosing words that conveyed truth without resentment that might poison the fragile trust forming between them. The Apache listened, silent, attentive, and when he finally responded, it was not with judgment but with a quiet acknowledgment of her resilience. "You carry yourself with a strength that is uncommon," he said. "That is why you are here and why you have endured." The day passed in a rhythm of quiet preparation and reflection. She learned the patterns of the land, the signs of danger, and the subtle ways the Apache interacted with the world around him. She realized that survival was more than endurance. It was understanding, observation, and the willingness to act decisively when the moment demanded. The fear that had gripped her upon arrival had transformed into awareness, the anxiety into strategy, and the uncertainty into cautious hope. As evening approached, the plains took on the soft hues of dusk. She and the Apache sat near the fire, watching the horizon. She felt a sense of calm she had not experienced since the day she had been sold. The ropes were gone. The threat had been met. The trust had begun to take root. And in that moment, she understood the first lesson the harsh landscape had taught her, that endurance, courage, and awareness could transform captivity into opportunity, fear into understanding, and a moment of danger into a step toward freedom. She looked at the Apache and saw not a captor, but a guide, a partner, a man who had taught her lessons in patience, strategy, and respect. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw acknowledgment, not just of her survival but of her growth, her awareness, and her capacity to meet the challenges of this new world. For the first time since her capture, she felt truly seen, understood, and valued. The night deepened, but there was no longer fear in the air. Instead, there was a quiet sense of possibility, the promise of a future that could be shaped by choice, intelligence, and courage. The Apache tended the fire with the same careful precision she had come to admire, and she sat nearby, feeling the warmth and security of a bond forged through trial and observation. The past, the rancher, the sail, the fear had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by experience, understanding, and the first glimmers of trust. They spoke little as the stars appeared overhead. Words were unnecessary. The lessons had been learned through action, observation, and endurance. She felt the tension that had gripped her slowly release, replaced by a sense of mastery over the circumstances she had once feared. The plains, the tent, the ropes, the Apache all had become part of a story she had navigated, a chapter that demanded courage, intelligence, and patience. Before sleep claimed her, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the greed of others, the betrayal, the fear, and now the cautious hope that had begun to grow. She understood that survival was not just about enduring danger, but about learning, observing, and forging bonds that could turn isolation into partnership. The Apache had taught her that lesson, not through words alone, but through presence, patience, and trust earned in the crucible of circumstance. As she drifted into sleep, the firelight flickering over the canvas walls, she felt a sense of completion, a quiet acknowledgement that she had survived, learned, and grown. The challenges were not gone, but the first steps toward understanding, trust, and a hopeful future had been taken. She knew the plains were still wild, that danger remained, and that every day would require awareness, courage, and intelligence. Yet for the first time, she felt capable, prepared, and connected to a world she had once feared. The Apache lay nearby, vigilant but calm, a figure of quiet strength that had become both guide and protector. She understood that the lessons of the tent, the night, and the confrontation outside would stay with her, shaping her choices and strengthening her resolve. She was no longer merely a captive of circumstance. She was a participant in her own survival, a witness to the power of trust, observation, and courage. The wind carried the scent of grasses and distant water, a promise of life and continuity. She breathed deeply, feeling the world around her in a way she never had before. Aware of danger, aware of opportunity, aware of the choices that would shape the days to come. And in that awareness, she felt hope, the quiet, resilient hope that comes from enduring, learning, and preparing to face the world with intelligence and courage. As dawn broke fully over the plains, she stepped outside the tent, the ropes long gone, and faced the horizon with a sense of determination and calm. The Apache remained close, his eyes scanning the land, but no longer with the intensity of suspicion alone. There was respect now, a recognition of her resilience, intelligence, and readiness to face the challenges ahead. Together they stood, not captor and captive, but allies, partners, and survivors of a trial that had tested courage, patience, and trust. The story of the plains, the tent, and the night's tension had come to an end. The fears, the doubts, and the threats had been met, navigated, and transformed into lessons and understanding. She was free, not just from the ropes, but from the paralysis of fear, ready to move forward in a world that demanded courage, insight, and endurance. The Apache remained by her side, a silent acknowledgement that trust could be earned, alliances could be formed, and hope could flourish even in the most uncertain of circumstances. And as the morning sun rose fully, spilling light across the endless grasses, she took her first steps into a life she had once thought lost, carrying with her the lessons of survival, the strength of endurance, and the first glimmers of a future shaped by courage, partnership, and understanding. The plains stretched before her, wild and full of possibility, and she walked forward with a heart tempered by experience, a mind sharpened by observation, and a spirit strengthened by the trials she had endured. The story had reached its resolution, the conflicts addressed, and the lessons learned. She was no longer merely a pawn of circumstance. She was a woman who had survived, who had grown, and who had begun to write the next chapter of her life with courage, intelligence, and hope. The rancher, the sail, the night of uncertainty all had been transformed into experience, wisdom, and the quiet triumph of resilience. She looked to the Apache, who nodded faintly, a gesture that spoke more than words could. Trust had been earned, fear had been tempered, and the lessons of patience, observation, and courage would guide them both in the days ahead. The plains, once threatening and uncertain, now held the promise of freedom, opportunity, and the unfolding of a story written by choice, strength, and intelligence. And as she took a final look at the horizon, feeling the warmth of the sun and the quiet strength of the man who had guided her through the darkness, she understood the truth of the journey. Survival is not just endurance, but learning, understanding, and the courage to act. The ropes were gone, the threats had passed, and a new chapter of life awaited, shaped by wisdom, partnership, and the quiet, enduring strength of the human spirit. The plains stretched endlessly, golden and alive. She stepped forward, ready, free, and full of hope, carrying with her the lessons, the courage, and the confidence that would shape the days to come. The story had reached its natural end, but life itself, full of opportunity and promise, awaited beyond the horizon. And in that moment, she smiled, feeling the full weight of survival, understanding, and the first taste of true freedom.